The crystal water pitcher shattered against the dining room wall about 6 inches from my left ear. I didn't flinch. At 71, you learn that flinching is what they want. My son-in-law stood at the head of my table. My table. The one my late wife Pearl and I bought at an estate sale in 1978. Breathing like a bull. His face the color of a brick left out in summer. My daughter sat 3 feet away with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on her plate of cold pot roast. She did not look up. That was the part that broke something loose in me. Not the pitcher. Not the shouting. The folded hands. "You're going to sign it tomorrow," my son-in-law said. His voice had gone quiet, which was worse than the yelling. "First thing, we meet the notary at 9. I picked a sliver of glass out of my sleeve and set it on the tablecloth. I said, "All right." He blinked. I think he'd been waiting for an argument. He'd had a whole speech ready. I could feel it humming under his skin. When I just said "all right" and reached for my water glass like nothing had happened, something flickered behind his eyes. Confusion. Then a sneer of victory. He thought he'd finally broken the old man. He looked at my daughter and snapped his fingers like she was a dog. She got up and started clearing the plates. I'd built that dining room myself. Hung the crown molding alone over a long weekend in 1981 because Pearl wanted it done before her sister visited from Tulsa. There was a small chip in the corner where I'd dropped a hammer, and Pearl had laughed so hard she had to sit down on the stairs. Every time I walked into that room, I saw her sitting on those stairs laughing. And now this man, who had been in my family for 9 years, wanted me to sign the house over so they could manage my care and consolidate the family assets. Those were his exact words. I'd been hearing them for 6 months. They sounded like something he'd memorized off a podcast. I went up to bed at 9:30, the way I always did. I lay there in the dark next to the cold side where Pearl used to sleep, and I listened to them talking downstairs. My son-in-law's voice was rising and falling in that pitch men use when they're celebrating without wanting to seem like they're celebrating. My daughter was barely a murmur. At one point, I heard her laugh. A short, nervous laugh. And that was the laugh of a woman who's afraid of her husband and pretending she isn't. I knew that laugh because Pearl's mother had it for 43 years. I waited until I heard their bedroom door close upstairs. The guest room. My guest room. They'd been living in my house for 14 months at that point, ever since his investment firm had what he called a temporary cash flow correction. Then I got out of bed, put on my robe, and went down to the basement. I keep an old filing cabinet down there. Olive green, dented on the side. Used to belong to a dentist in Norman, Oklahoma. I bought it at auction in 1989. Pearl always wanted me to throw it out. I'm glad I didn't. From the bottom drawer, I took out a manila folder I'd been adding to since March. Bank statements. 2 of them, from accounts I wasn't supposed to know about. A printout of a transfer to a holding company registered in Belize. Photographs of the title page of a quitclaim deed they'd had drawn up 6 weeks before, with my signature already forged on the bottom in pencil, ready to be inked over once they got me cooperative. A recording on a little digital device of my son-in-law on the phone with his brother saying, and I quote, "The old man's mostly gone upstairs. We just got to be patient and firm. Mostly gone upstairs." I sat on the basement steps in my slippers, and I looked at that folder for a long time. I'd been told twice in my life that I didn't have what it took. Once by a drill sergeant at Fort Benning in 1972, and once by my own father when I left the family hardware business in 1976 to start my own contracting outfit. Both of them lived to eat those words. My son-in-law was going to make 3. But first I had to think about the boy, my grandson. 8 years old. Skinny like his mother was at that age, with a cowlick that wouldn't lay down no matter what. He called me Pop, just Pop, not Grandpa, because when he was 3, couldn't say the second part, and it stuck. He came down for breakfast every morning at 6:15 sharp, because that's when I made pancakes, and he'd sit on the counter swinging his legs and tell me about whatever dream he'd had. The night of the picture, he'd been at a sleepover at a friend's house. That was the only reason it had happened. They never raised their voices when the boy was home. They saved it for when he wasn't. I knew, sitting there on those basement steps, that whatever I did, I had to do it in a way that put him with me at the end. Not them. Me. Because if those two went down, and the boy stayed with them, the boy went down too. And I'd already lost Pearl. I was not losing that child. The next morning, I made pancakes. My son-in-law came down in a polo shirt at 7:45, smelling of expensive aftershave he'd bought with my credit card statement. He gave me a look that was supposed to be friendly. Big day, Pop. He'd started calling me Pop about a year ago. I'd never given him permission. The boy noticed it once and asked me about it, and I told him only special people get to call me that. The boy nodded very seriously and said, "Then he shouldn't." I poured my son-in-law a cup of coffee. "Big day," I agreed. My daughter came down in a beige sweater and sat in the chair Pearl used to sit in. She hadn't sat in that chair in the 11 years since her mother died. Not once. And now suddenly she was sitting there like it belonged to her. She didn't meet my eyes. She drank orange juice. She said, "Daddy, we just want what's best." I said, "I know, sweetheart." I called her sweetheart on purpose. I watched her flinch. She knew I never called her that anymore, not since she'd married him. And the only reason I was using it now was to remind her of when she was small enough to sit on my knee and ask me to read her the same book 6 times in a row. She knew. She set her juice down very carefully and stared at the rim of the glass. My son-in-law clapped his hands. "Notary's at 9. Let's roll." I said, "I need to make a stop first." 20 minutes. Old buddy of mine, I promised him I'd drop off a part for his lawn tractor. He looked annoyed. "Can it wait?" "It's on the way," I said. He glanced at his watch, which was a $40,000 watch he'd bought himself last Christmas. He sighed like I was a child asking for one more cookie. "Fine, but quick." We took his car. He insisted on driving. I sat in the passenger seat with a brown paper bag in my lap, the kind you pack a lunch in, and I directed him to town. We pulled up in front of a low brick building on Sycamore Street. He frowned. "This isn't a house." "Old buddy of mine works here now," I said. 2 minutes. I got out before he could argue. I walked into the building. The sign on the door read, "Tesmer, Boyd, and Lavoie, attorneys at law." The receptionist looked up and smiled at me like an old friend, because by that point she was one. I'd been coming there twice a week for 2 months. I was in the lobby for about 90 seconds, long enough to hand off the brown paper bag and pick up a different one, long enough to sign one piece of paper. Then I walked back out. My son-in-law was on his phone in the driver's seat. I got in. I set the new paper bag down between my feet. "Sorry about that." "Whatever," he said. "Let's go." He drove me to the notary. I signed the document he put in front of me. It transferred ownership of my house, my retirement accounts, my truck, and what he believed to be my checking account to a holding company in his name. He was practically vibrating with how hard he was trying not to grin. My daughter, who'd ridden separately and met us there, signed as a witness. Her hands shook a little. The notary stamped it. My son-in-law shook a little. The notary stamped it. My son-in-law shook the notary's hand. Outside, in the parking lot, he turned to me and said, "See, Pop? Wasn't so bad." I said, "It wasn't, no." He didn't notice that I never called him by name. He never noticed anything that wasn't about him. That evening I told them I wanted to host a dinner. Saturday night, just family and a few of my old friends. To celebrate, I said, to celebrate the next chapter. My son-in-law lit up like a Christmas tree. He'd been wanting an excuse to invite his business associates over to see the house he now thought was his. "How many?" he asked. "Maybe 12, I said. "I'll cook." "You'll cook?" "I'll cook." Pearl's pot roast, her mother's recipe. My daughter's head came up at that. The pot roast was sacred. Pearl had only made it for Thanksgiving and Easter, and the one time her brother came back from overseas. My daughter looked at me for a long moment, and for just a flicker, I saw the girl she used to be, the one who used to help her mother roll out pie crust. Then her husband put his hand on her shoulder and squeezed, and the girl went away again. "Sounds great, Pop," he said. "I'll handle the wine." For 5 days, I cooked and cleaned and shopped. I did it cheerfully. I whistled. I asked my son-in-law's opinion on which tablecloth to use, and he picked one, and I used it. I asked my daughter to polish the silver, and she did. The boy helped me peel potatoes Friday night and asked me why I was so happy. I knelt down in front of him in the kitchen. I put both my hands on his shoulders. He had pancake syrup on his chin from breakfast that morning. I said, "Buddy, you remember the cabin?" He nodded. We'd been going to the same fishing cabin in eastern Oklahoma every summer since he was 4. Just him and me, 3 days each August. I said, "If anything ever happens, anything at all, anything that scares you or makes you sad, you go to Mrs. Pendle next door. You tell her you need to call Pop. She has my number on her refrigerator. And then we'll go to the cabin. Okay?" He looked up at me with those serious brown eyes and he didn't ask a single question. He just said, "Okay, Pop." I kissed the top of his head. He smelled like a kid. That warm, slightly soapy smell that breaks your heart if you let it. Saturday came. I had the dining room set for 13. My son-in-law had invited 4 of his associates, men I'd never met, all of them in expensive shirts. My daughter had invited her sister-in-law, his sister, a thin woman who never made eye contact. The rest were my guests. My son-in-law had glanced at the seating chart, seen names he didn't recognize, and dismissed them. "Old friends of yours, Pop," he'd said. "Sweet." The first one to arrive was a man named Cyrus Whitlow. No, that's not right. That's a fellow I went to school with. The first one to arrive was a man named Garrick Holm. Garrick had been my contractor's lawyer for 36 years. He walked in with a leather satchel and shook my hand and said, "Long time, friend." My son-in-law shook his hand too, very confidently, having no idea who he was. The second to arrive was a woman in a navy pantsuit named Idabel Cresswell. She was a forensic accountant. She'd been retired 4 years and had come out of retirement as a favor to her late husband's poker buddy, me, to spend 2 months going through the financial records I'd quietly gathered. She introduced herself as an old neighbor. My son-in-law kissed her hand. I almost laughed. The third was a man named Detective Owusu Bramwell, who introduced himself as Owen and said he'd known me from the old neighborhood. My son-in-law gave him a long look, suspicious for the first time, but Detective Bramwell wore a tweed jacket and had a kind smile, and after a minute my son-in-law decided he was nobody. The fourth was a slim man named Renfield Spader, who introduced himself as a friend from church. He was actually a senior officer at the Oklahoma State Banking Department, who'd taken a particular professional interest in offshore wire activity routed through Belize. My son-in-law's associates arrived all at once, loud and clapping each other on the back. They smelled of cologne and entitlement. One of them, a tall man with a shaved head, looked around my dining room and said, "This your place now, brother? Nice digs." My son-in-law smiled. "Family place." I served drinks. I refilled glasses. I was the perfect host. My daughter sat very still at the foot of the table, where Pearl used to sit, and didn't eat much. The boy was upstairs. I'd arranged that on purpose. Mrs. Kydane, Pendle, had picked him up an hour before dinner to take him to a movie. Her grandson's birthday outing, I'd told my daughter, and she'd nodded vaguely without registering it. Pot roast came out at 7:15. The pot roast was perfect. Pearl would have approved. I carved it at the table while my son-in-law watched me with a smug warmth, as if he were proud of his own cleverness in arranging all of this. He even raised his glass and gave a little speech. He thanked me. He thanked me for understanding. He thanked me for being smart enough to know when to transition. He said the word legacy 3 times. When he was finished, I set my carving knife down. I wiped my hands on the cloth napkin Pearl had embroidered the year before she died. Little blue cornflowers, the corners. I looked around the table. I said, "I'd like to make a toast of my own." Everybody quieted. My son-in-law beamed at his associates as if to say, "Watch the old man." I said, "To my late wife, to the home we built, to the daughter we raised." I looked at her. She looked back. And to honesty, which is the only thing in this house I will not let anyone steal. The room went still. My son-in-law's smile fell about a quarter of an inch, not enough for his associates to see, but enough for me. I said, "Garrick, would you do the honors?" Garrick Holmes stood up. He opened his leather satchel and took out a stack of documents about 3 inches thick. He said in his easy Oklahoma drawl, "Folks, before y'all eat any more of that excellent pot roast, I want to clarify a few items for the room." My son-in-law's face changed. He said, "What is this?" Garrick smiled. "This is a packet of materials concerning the property transfer executed 5 days ago. Specifically, the transfer's been rescinded under Title 60 of the Oklahoma statutes, owing to fraud in the inducement, undue influence on a senior citizen, and the small additional matter of a forged quitclaim deed dated 6 weeks prior to the alleged transfer." He held up a photograph, which we have. My son-in-law stood up. His chair scraped. "This is a joke." Idabel Cresswell pulled out her own folder. "I'd also like to introduce for the gentleman at the far end of the table a financial summary of the past 14 months. She looked at my son-in-law's associates. "You boys invested with him, didn't you?" 3 of them nodded slowly, suddenly looking like they wished they were anywhere else. "I think you'll be very interested in pages 4 through 19, which detail how your investment funds were routed through a shell entity in Belize and used in part to purchase a $40,000 watch, a leased vehicle, and roughly $210,000 in losses on a cryptocurrency token that was, as it turns out, a fraud the federal authorities have been tracking for some time." The man with the shaved head said, "What did you just say?" Detective Bramwell stood up. He set his napkin down very neatly beside his plate. He said, "I'm going to ask everyone to remain seated. My name is Detective Bramwell with the Oklahoma City Police Department, and I'd like to have a conversation with a few of you outside in a moment." Renfield Spader nodded to him from the other end of the table. My son-in-law looked at me. His face had gone gray. He looked at the door. He looked at me again. He said, "You." I said, "I served you dinner." He sat down, hard, like his legs had quit. My daughter started crying. Not loud, just tears sliding down her face, dripping onto her plate. She looked up at me finally for the first time in a year, and her eyes were the eyes of the little girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder watching westerns on Sunday afternoons. She whispered, "Daddy, I didn't know it was." I said, "Sweetheart, I know exactly what you did and what you didn't do. We will talk about it when this is over." She put her face in her hands. Detective Bramwell walked my son-in-law and 2 of his associates out of the dining room and into a pair of cars that were waiting at the curb. I hadn't seen the cars arrive. They'd come quietly, no lights. The remaining associates left in a hurry, with Renfield Spader politely collecting business cards from each of them on their way out the door. The thin sister-in-law fled without saying goodbye. When the dust settled, it was just me and Garrick and Idabel and my daughter at the table. The pot roast had gotten cold. I sat down at the head of the table, my chair, my real chair, the one I'd sat in for 46 years, and I put my hands flat on the wood. My daughter looked at me. She said, "What happens to me?" I said, "That depends on you." She started crying again. I let her. After a while, I said, "There's a recording of him telling his brother that you were going to be a problem, that you'd go soft if pressed, that he was going to need to handle you eventually, just so you understand who you've been protecting." She closed her eyes. I said, "You can stay in the guest room until you find your feet, not the master. The guest room. And you will not be alone with the boy for a while. Not until I'm satisfied. Do you understand?" She nodded. She kept nodding. I said, "Your mother would have wanted you to have a chance, Diane. That's not her name. I won't say her name. She's working on becoming the person who deserves to have her name said again." So you got a chance. 1. Don't waste it. I went out on the porch. The October air was cold and dry, the way it gets in Oklahoma right before the first hard freeze. I sat in the rocking chair Pearl and I had bought together in Eureka Springs in 1992. I rocked slowly. Across the street, Mrs. Mann. Pendle's porch light flicked on, and a minute later her car pulled into the driveway. The boy got out. He had a paper bag of popcorn in one hand and his jacket in the other. He saw me on the porch and he ran across the lawn in that wobbly way. Kids run, and he climbed up into my lap like he was 4 years old again. He said, "Pop, is everyone gone?" I said, "Most of them, buddy." He nodded against my chest. He didn't ask which ones. After a minute, he said, "Can we go to the cabin soon?" I said, "How about next weekend?" "Okay," he said. And he stayed there in my lap smelling like popcorn and kid soap. And I rocked us both for a long time. I want to say one more thing to whoever's listening to this. To whatever stranger is hearing an old man's voice on whatever device you've got. That somebody in your life is making you feel small, making you doubt your own mind, making you sign things you don't want to sign, making you fold your hands at the table while they break dishes. Listen. They are not waiting for you to fight back the way they expect. They are waiting for you to do nothing. So don't fight back the way they expect. Don't fight back at all. Get quiet. Get organized. Find the people who love you. Build the file. And then, when the time is exactly right, serve the dinner. I'm 71 years old. I buried my wife. I almost lost my daughter. I came close to losing my house and my name and the boy who calls me Pop. But I'm still here. And the chair at the head of the table. That one's still mine. I've had a lot of nights since that one to sit on the porch and think about how it all went down. And the thing I keep coming back to is this. Every choice my son-in-law made was a seed, and every seed grew exactly the plant it was supposed to grow. He chose to mistake my quiet for weakness. He chose to mistake my politeness for confusion. He chose to think an old man in slippers couldn't tell when he was being robbed. Those weren't accidents. Those were decisions he made every single morning for 14 months. And decisions, in my experience, are the only thing that actually builds a life. The picture he threw at my head didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of 100 smaller cruelties he'd already gotten away with. And each one taught him he could go a little further the next time. That's how it always works. People show you who they are in small doses first. And if you don't pay attention, the doses get bigger until one day, the dose is a pitcher of water aimed at your skull. I want my grandson to learn 3 things from what happened in that house, and I want to say them plain because I'm too old to dress things up. The first is decency. Not the soft kind. The hard kind. The kind that makes you set the table for the person who hurt you, so that when the truth arrives at dinner, it arrives with manners. You don't have to be cruel to be strong. In fact, the strongest move I ever made in my life was carving a pot roast with my hands steady while my heart wanted to break something. Decency is what separates a man who wins from a man who just gets even. And the difference matters more than most folks understand. The second is to use your head. I almost lost everything because for a long while I let my feelings, the shame of being slapped down in my own dining room, the grief of watching my daughter fold her hands, run the show. The night I went down to that basement and opened that filing cabinet was the night I started thinking again instead of just hurting. Pearl used to say a clear head is the only honest weapon a person carries, and she was right. Build the file. Talk to the lawyer. Sit with the accountant. Don't act on the first wave of anger. Act on the 7th wave, when the water's gone quiet and you can see what's actually at the bottom. The third is grit. Plain old stubbornness. The willingness to wake up the next morning and the next and the next, making pancakes and pretending nothing is wrong while you do the slow work of saving your own life. There's no glory in it. Nobody claps. But that's where the whole thing gets won. My grandson is going to grow up in this house. My daughter is going to find her feet, or she isn't. And that part is up to her now. And me. I'm going to keep sitting at the head of my own table for whatever years I've got left. I earned that chair twice, once by building it and once by taking it back.